Ah, all right. We are live.
Boom!
Yes, sir. All right, we'll give it like a quick minute, see if anybody hops in the chat. If not, we'll get going anyways, because fuck them. Got me
Ah,
my Iron Man drink.
oh, is that Coke or what is that?
No, it's a caffeine-free energy drink. I'm trying to like. No, I'm not. I'm definitely not quitting cold turkey because wouldn't last. But I'm trying to consume a little bit less caffeine because my tolerance is getting really high. And
Uh,
A, it becomes expensive, and B, it's just like I don't want to have like heart palpitations in order to feel awake.
yeah,
So I'm trying to drink. I actually haven't had coffee in a couple days, and it's been a weird adjustment, but it is what it is. I mean, you remember when we were in New York? For me, I was like, yeah, I'll take like 5 shots of espresso in my morning coffee,
yeah.
so I
That's
could go.
what I hear you. I've drank less coffee too because I haven't been. I'm going in and out of work, but even when I'm at work, I seem to, for whatever reason, I'm not drinking as much coffee anymore. So it's probably better. I'm sleeping a little bit better now too, and
Mm,
whatever. The
mm, mm.
irony is maybe I'm getting healthier during these pandemic times, but I don't want to jinx anything.
I mean, the world is, man. You see all these reports about the quality of air going up in like these massively urban areas,
Yeah.
and a lot of like wild animals are coming back to spaces like that, and it's like I'm hoping that some countries learn that we need to be a little bit more aware of what we're doing.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of eye-opening experiences in terms of what we can what we need and what we can do without. In particular, we can survive and do without diamond distribution. Woohoo!
Mm, the death of Diamond, the
The
coronavirus.
death of diamond. It's always been a diamond with a flaw, which is normally a good thing. It certainly wasn't a pebble without, but I'll butcher the metaphors and analogies as we talk.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right. Well, we've given it a couple minutes. I'm sure people will pop in as we go, but I'll do the intro for the sake of the video on demand. All right. Hello, guys. Welcome to the 33rd episode of Let's Talk Comics, where myself and another co host in the comic book community discuss one of the many facets of the storytelling medium that is comics. Whether it be stories, creators, characters, constructs, or adaptations, we hit it all. Today, we're going to be discussing something that's a little bit more industry based in how the COVID-19 is affecting the comic book industry. And of course, this week I am joined by the Canadian Caped Crusader, the other half of this dynamic duo, my friend Comic Boom. What is going on, my man?
Just enjoying these pandemic times, just like you, Dark Knight. What can you do? Sit back, read a comic, sip a Coke or any kind of beverage, and
Or an Iron Man
just
energy drink.
that's exactly right. What else can you do? But here we are talking comics. There are worse fates than this. There
There
are
are
still
worse,
worse fates.
for sure. There are worse fates than talking comics. We could be talking taxes, and that would not be pleasant.
That's
So.
not. All right.
All right. Just quick thing in the chat. We have JT Gamer saying hello. What's going on, man? Thank you for joining us during this time of quarantine and comics.
Hey,
Uh,
GT.
yeah. All right. So obviously, the coronavirus COVID-19 has been really sticking its fingers in a lot of different parts of the world, and let me preface this by saying that this isn't a doomsday conversation. This isn't us like the many people that try to predict the death of the comic book industry. But it is very apparent that it has had a large impact on the industry and that it will likely leave a lasting one moving forward. So, Comic Boom and I thought it was an appropriate conversation to have. And it also gives us a little bit of leniency about discussing maybe some of the ways that the industry could recover from this and walk out a little bit stronger than it came in. Natural selection. It is a process that I think impacts more than just biological life. So yeah, we'll get that moving forward. So the first thing is I'm wondering, especially because obviously, Comic Boom, you live in Canada, and the impact of the coronavirus in the comic book industry is obviously probably thought of more on a domestic front for the United States because it is a product of America. And I'm wondering if there are any, because I know you keep up to date with like all of the comic book news, and I'm wondering if there's anything in particular that's affecting your neck of the woods regarding comic books and comic book distribution, or maybe the LCS, that isn't as present in the United States.
Well, actually, Diamond Distribution, my retailer gets by far most of his comic books through Diamond Distribution. So they do ship North America wide. So we do get my retailer does deal with Diamond Distribution, and it's interesting. The reaction of my retailer to all this, and just as a little bit of background, I'm really good friends with my retailer. I've known him for 25 years. We're friends. We go to Calgary, Alberta routinely to go to different comic book swaps and everything. And so he's a good friend as well as someone who he doesn't like getting involved online. I've invited him more than once on my channel. He just, it's not his cup of tea. He'd rather not, be vocal about certain things, but he doesn't mind me talking about it. The bottom line is if you can believe this, and this says something in my view negative about Diamond Distribution in particular. He was actually relieved when Diamond was no longer shipping to the shops. He felt relief. And the reason why, and he's not alone, he felt relief because he doesn't have to guess what his customers are going to be buying anymore during a pandemic. He says it's difficult enough trying to pick and choose what comic books are going to sell and which ones aren't, because he's always playing a guessing game. Because now he's been in business for 25 years. He about 25% of his business is comic books. So he's smart enough. He's been doing it long enough. He diversifies. So losing comic books are not going to destroy his business because he's not that stupid. He's learned something in 25 years. And frankly, it's always a guessing game. He's had numerous frustrations with Diamond, as all retailers have had. And, often when we talk about the problems in the comic book industry, we don't emphasize enough the problem, which is Diamond Distribution. Their monopoly. In my view, they engage in illegal practices. But the fact is, in order to be held accountable, you need to be sued. No one's going to sue them because all comic shops are broke. And really, when's the last time there was really a collective action taken against Diamond Distribution? There just isn't, because who else is going to ship? Now this is a topic. This is a complicated topic about distribution and the history of distribution. Suffice to say that my retailer was relieved. He knows that if myself and all the other people that buy comics from them, if we got to wait 2 or 3 months to get more print comics, that we're going to come back. And that's the reality. And I just want to end this opening comment from myself by referring to the comments of Adam Phillips, the Director of Marketing Service for DC Comics. He says, he made it very clear that he says, all of our data shows that digital consumers and physical consumers are two different audiences. That tells you something. Now, what's interesting about that is that we have never known, it's never been disclosed what the sales are digitally. We know what they are on Comic-Con, the physical copies. We've never known what the specific digital sales were for comics. But that's a hint right there when they say that DC itself distinguishes, and they believe there's two separate audiences, the digital and the physical copies. And the fact that they're going to continue to print digitally, or continue to market digitally, even next week, April 1st, and moving forward, and they're going to worry about the print market. They'll reevaluate if the pandemic continues beyond 2 or 3 months. That tells you something very interesting. And in particular, the fact that they're no longer beholden to Diamond Distribution and are exploring their options, as you've indicated earlier. That says so much.
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit comforting, because I think that this pandemic has definitely shown the big two publishers, along with the rest of the industry, that their pathway for distributing comics from the producers to the consumers is incredibly weak. The chain is not strong because it's foundationally held on the back of Diamond Distribution, which, as you said, has some definite questionable decisions that they've made in the past. So I think that's an important thing to know. And on that, the Comic-Con numbers also only represent Diamond distribution. They get those numbers directly from Diamond, as far as I understand. And there are
Correct.
some distributors of like graphic novels, I believe some smaller distributors, because I know that in the UK, I know Titan Books distributes some DC Comics in terms of trades and whatnot. So there's something to be said about that. But I think that one of the things to discuss before we get into kind of what could happen as a fallout, with Diamond and Diamond potentially becoming obsolete, is discussing how exactly it's affecting the industry now, right? Um, this is huge. I mean, like I said earlier, the pandemic is affecting pretty much all aspects of life. But when you specifically look at the comic book stores, it's obviously prompted statewide shutdowns, which force non-essential businesses that are deemed non-essential to either completely close down, or as some comic book retailers have started to transition to, delivery and curbside pickup and things of that nature to, engage in social distancing. But with that, obviously, Diamond stopped distribution, which puts a huge strain on local comic book stores. And DC announces ventures in the multi-distribution method, and then eventually kind of coalescing in them completely shutting down their printers, which I think the first prospect was a little bit scary, because comic books as a periodical medium really, and especially the big two with large continuities to handle, really rely on that month to month sale. But also because of the industry, and you had pointed at this earlier, the industry forces um, retailers to pre-order months and months and months in advance. This is really, I think, going to skew uh, local comic book store purchases, and it could. I'm not saying it's necessarily going to be a negative thing, but it could have some ramifications moving forward, because obviously, if this pandemic lasts more than the next couple of weeks and we're left on these lockdowns or quarantines, however you want to phrase it, we're going to be getting some interesting readings moving forward. And I hope that it begins to alter the way that these publishers are forcing, or maybe it's a Diamond thing, are forcing these local comic book stores to make their order, because I mean, you're pretty much playing, you're gambling, you're trying to make predictions moving forward. So it's a risky business.
It is. It is a risky business, and well, I guess let's just we got to put our cards on the table here. Let's be very blunt. There's nothing you can do about it at this point. Okay, the
Mhm.
pandemic is here. Uh, comic shops, comic shops are hurting right now, not because of Diamond per se, not because of DC or Marvel. They're hurting right now because of the pandemic. That's the first thing. So
Mhm.
we can't, we got to give the pandemic the blame for most of it right off the bat. But now,
Right.
having said that, obviously, uh, DC making the decision they have, it's it's going to have some impact on comic book shops. However, and I've indicated this to you in the past, and maybe this is an unpopular opinion, but it's got to happen. Something has to change, and whenever it's just like the human body. When we do something, when we're breaking a bad habit and we try something new, it always feels uncomfortable, right?
Mhm.
And if you're going outside your comfort zone, Diamond Distribution was the was the was functioning in dysfunction all the time. But and the attitude of the big two has always been, well, better the devil we know than the one we don't. Let's stick with Diamond. Let's stick with Diamond. Same with retailers, afraid of change,
Mhm.
and and everyone, when fans like us suggest, well, why don't you try new distribution, why don't you try this, try that, how many there have been retailers suggesting that, well, you don't know what you're talking about, you don't know what it's like to run a comic shop, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, guess what, it's happening now. Whether you like it or not. And I firmly believe that we'll be saying, I told you so, I told you so, I told you so. I'll be one of those saying it. I got no problem saying it. Maybe I'm a little bit of a jerk, but this is a long time coming, and it's got to be happening. And just to be clear here, when DC is moving toward a new printer, they already have new distributors in place. They already have they've got DC has got uh, Ingram. They got Simon Schuster. They've got what was it? Uh, uh, Penguin Random House is their new distributing partner, and rumor has it that according to Bleeding Cool, Penguin Random House has rumored that they might even buy Diamond. So there might be Diamond might even being bought out by Penguin Random House, and Random House is a big time publisher of books. They've got connections. They've got their own distribution network into the bookstores, and that's what DC's looking at. Because bear in mind, DC has moved toward publishing more young adult graphic novels, and they're looking to powerful new distribution networks. And that's one of the things that they're into is the Penguin Random House. And if Penguin is looking to expand their markets, you can possibly expect to see comic books sold in bookstores, which quite frankly is a much better. There's more bookstores than comic book shops. And we have to distinguish here between the death of the direct sale market versus the death of the comic book market. Just because the direct sale market dies, because it doesn't mean that comic book industry is going to die. It just means you're going to buy your comic book shops at Kohl's bookstore or Chapters instead of your local comic book shop. That's not the death of the comic book industry. Now, I love the direct sale market. There's things to like about it. But if we lose it, I'm not going to lose that much sleep over it if I can buy my comic book shops at bookstores. And bear in mind that that's what DC is doing. DC has a lot of these options already in place, and they're just sort of like moving the chess pieces a little bit, and they're not beholden to Diamond distribution anymore.
Yeah, I think that the direct market's still very important, and it might just be my bias and tendency to try to support small businesses. That's just kind of the type of consumer I try to be. And also I think having the comic book store as a specialty store, I think is a very important part of the culture. I think one thing to take into consideration is although, moving to that indirect market sale could save the industry financially, I think there's something to be said about the culture and the cultural impact on comic book fandom because you make a very good point, and I can't deny it anyway whatsoever. But I still think it is very important that we have a decent population of comic book stores that can foster this culture and this innovation. And I think to another end, one thing to look at here is when you're putting these comics in bookstores, I think just as much as you might have the idea that it'll grant comics more exposure to new readers, there's a lot of competition. You're going to have way more competition for people's eyes and for their money in a bookstore, especially if, I don't know if in Canada, if you have like a BAM, like a Books A Million, but it's a massive, massive book retailer, or a Barnes and Noble. Like, those are huge stores. And I can't help but think that especially if comic books, your comic books are already present in places like BAM's and some Barnes and Nobles, but they're already stowed way in the back. It's not like they're getting prime real estate in these bookstores, So I think that that's something to take into consideration. And my comments here are totally indicative of my general stance to be very middle of the road. I'm never really comfortable making these big statements about the future because I think there are so many different factors that'll come into play here. Like I said, especially with looking at the potential competition of being in a bookstore, even though you're obviously getting more foot traffic. So I think it's ultimately the potential of Penguin Random House buying Diamond is going to be huge because Penguin is one of the 6 huge names in book publishing right now and distribution. So I think that'll help to make comic book distribution a lot more efficient because they know markets and they already have a really nice system in place that I'm sure that to some degrees they're going to have to adjust to a slightly different industry. But even then, there are a lot of benefits to that. But I think, again, it's just paying attention to the cultural impact and the potential logistics of putting it in a bookstore when, you go from having a couple hundred competitors to sell a single book to maybe, a couple 100,000 competitors for your eye and for your money. I think it's just something to take into consideration here.
It's and just to add to what you're saying, and again, I've got all this stuff is from Bleeding Cool. Now you can take some of this with a grain of salt, but I believe what I'm about to read is something that is factual, and that is that uh, DC has advised, and Boom Studios has advised, and other comic publishers have advised, other than Image Comics, which is Image Comics, incidentally, is the only comic book company with an exclusive contract with Diamond. I think
Hmm.
most people don't realize that.
Didn't know that.
DC and Marvel, for example, they've encouraged retailers recently to get accounts with Ingram, which and Simon and Schuster, which are both book publishers.
Hmm.
And Ingram has sells Marvel, DC, Dark Horse, IDW, Dynamite, Boom, Archie, and Scholastic. Simon and
Wow.
Schuster books sell Boom Studios, Humanoids, Legendary, and Rebellion Comics. And Image is the only comic book publisher exclusive to Diamond Book distributors. Now, this is important. So these are relationships that the comic book publishers have already been fostering over the last number of years, but still the bulk of it, the distribution goes through Diamond. So this change, I suspect, has been evolving, or maybe been in the works for maybe some time. And particularly, look, if you're AT&T right now, and you're already not necessarily beholden to the nostalgic era of comic books, and you're corporate AT&T, you're going to be looking for the cheapest, most efficient, most productive way to get your new product to market.
Hmm.
And if you've been told by your head of marketing for DC that there's a clear distinction between a digital audience and a physical media audience, that's going to play a role into what you're going to do. And are you really going to? There are so many things about Diamond distribution that is arcane, and still like 20, definitely see why DC has no problem. AT&T has no problem saying, well, absolutely try different distribution networks. Why wouldn't we?
Hmm.
Because really, like, I hate to say it, but AT&T doesn't strike me as being particularly concerned. If 20%, there was the president of Miles High Comics. He did an email. He says if we lose 20% of the comic book retailer market, that this is the end. This is the end of it. I don't think it is at the end of it at all. I
Hmm.
really, truly don't. Because I don't think for one second that DC Comics, Marvel, with all these, there's thousands of distributors out there. People forget that because for some reason we the DC the comic book industry is ridiculously unique with only primarily one distributor. But that doesn't have to be the case. I think this is going to foster innovation. I think this is going to foster new creative ways moving forward. And I think that the retailers will survive. Retailers are brilliant people. They're hardworking people. They'll find a way to get the product. And I think there'll be enough distributors out there to make that a reality.
I mean, you make some really interesting points, and I can definitely appreciate the optimism here moving forward. And you know, you and I both know that the death of the comic book industry has been something that is a topic of conversation every couple of years, and there's always a group of people that are preaching its inevitability. And I don't think that comic books will ever specifically die because they will adapt. I think that the market will certainly change and the way we're distributing them will certainly change. But comics, I think, will be around forever, especially because now that they're owned by these larger companies who are farming out these properties into other adaptations that will make them more money, them keeping these comic book publishers open allows them to get paid to create ideas for them to then get paid billions of dollars later to put it into a film. You know what I'm saying? It's an idea farm for them to develop these other properties. So I think just looking at it in the coldest, hardest, most financially driven way, I think that the comic book industry will always survive. How it survives and what form we see it in moving forward, that'll all change. And I think one of the things I want to talk about is the digital network of comic book sales out there. And you brought up how, an executive at DC Comics had mentioned that there were two different audiences for people who are reading digital and those of us who are reading physical. And I'm wondering, with this massive delay, do you think we're going to see, and we, by me saying we are going to see I know we're not going to see it because digital never releases sales numbers, but do you think that there could be a rise in digital sales from impatient comic book fans? Because as far as, we know we're left in the dark, and this massive multi continental shutdown, it could last months. So I'm wondering if you think that there could be some sort of shift to a larger
I,
digital market moving forward.
I think two things. Number one, I think there will be a temporary blip in digital sales that will increase. I do believe that. Yes, it might be small, but there will be an increase. And number two, I don't think that there is going to be a corresponding decrease in the print sales once the pandemic ends. In other words, I think that when people go back into the comic shops, assuming that they survive being closed down during the pandemic, but the ones that have diversified enough, they're not going to close down anyway. I think that people are still going to buy the print media. In other words, let me give an example. For example, this coming Wednesday, I will digitally buy Batman issue 92 because I want to read James Tynion the Forest Batman story. I think he's doing a great job, and I'm going to buy it digitally. If 3-4 months from now, I'm finally able to go to my comic shop to buy the physical copy, I'm going to do that. I'm the audience that will do that, and I believe that most people that are used to physical media like me are still going to do that, even if it's 3 months after the fact. That's what I believe, and again, the harm done to the comic book industry is from the pandemic. In that 3-month time period, it's not the fault of DC or Marvel or any distribution network. So in terms of actual sales, providing the comic books are still open, I think that they're going to make it up. I think they're just going to have a really big month, maybe 3-4 months from now, when this pandemic is finally over, and people will just slowly make payments catching up on their physical copies. But maybe I'm being too optimistic.
Yeah, I like your approach, but I think that, just playing devil's advocate, there are a couple things that could kind of there are some definitely forks. There's some forks in the road there, and one of them being, individuals' financial security. I'm not going to air your business, but like, you have a very reliable job, and I think that a lot of people that read comic books, or at least a decent fraction, might not be in that same situation where it becomes plausible for them to buy digital copies and then go on and spend essentially double the money to buy the physicals. Because we've talked about this many times. Reading comics are an expensive hobby, especially in a world where you can go buy things for significantly cheaper that could arguably keep you entertained for longer. One of the things that saves this industry is obviously the diehard fans. Another, the iconic intellectual properties, and so on and so forth. And another thing to also take into consideration is, and I'm not saying that this represents an overwhelmingly large body of people, but there are certainly some decent sized populations of comic book fans who won't think of it as rationally as you or I would, and will blame DC Comics and will blame Marvel and Image and all of these different publishers because they aren't overwhelmingly aware of the distribution of the chain of distribution. So, I think that there are a couple of things that might render your thoughts there a little bit less cohesive in the end.
Yeah, you could be right. There's no question that, look, is it, even my job, by the way, is not as secure as some people might think. Even though I might be a lawyer by occupation, not too many people give a rat's ass about perpetuating lawsuits or conflict in a pandemic, especially when they got money, they keep it to themselves. They don't, legal work is not their priority, quite frankly. But I do hear what you're saying. That's why I'm saying right now, in a lot of comic book shops, comic book retailers are quite accustomed to putting people on payment plans. People show up and they'll buy a portion of their pull list. There's my retailer does that all the time anyway here in my smaller community of 60,000 people. He's got people who have got pull lists, will come in and buy 10 comics at a time. They buy what they can afford, and he accommodates them, and he makes arrangements with them. He can only, depending on your tier, he'll only allow you to put so many on your list depending on the payment plan you have. And I think that retailers will just find a way to sort of catch up that way. And again, I am being optimistic, but regardless, I would still maintain that the industry is not going to die. And worst case scenario, and I'm speaking as a fan, like I said, one of my good friends is a retailer. I would never wish upon him the loss of a business. But I don't think he'll lose his business because he's made other plans accordingly, and he's diversified. You know, he sells toys and action figures and everything else. But I would say that regardless of anything, I just don't see this as being the end of the comic book industry. Could this be the end of the direct sale market where you're going to buy your comic books at a cool looking comic book shop, which I love, and I don't want to lose that. But guess what? If we have to buy it at the comic book store, if you're a genuine, true lover of comic books, you know, we'll find a way. And if the market is still there, and I think it is, I think those of us who love comics, we're not going anywhere. We're just self-isolating right now. You know, we're just lying dormant. You know, I think this is like kryptonite to us. We're weakened right now, but as soon as this pandemic's gone, we're going to get our powers back, and we're going to be back in the comic shops or the bookstores. And whether it's a comic book or a comic book shop or a bookstore, we're going to be there buying comic books.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely fair to say that, you know, this pandemic is going to rock the comic book industry moving forward, whether or not it is in a more positive way, like you are, you know, so graciously saying, or whether or not, you know, this could really force the industry to adapt to some really negative climates here. But I wonder, you know, could this could the potential of these bigger publishers looking at other distribution options allow for any changes in the retail price of these books? Because I can imagine that, and this is just me speculating, that if DC and Marvel were to switch over to this multi-distribution model, and especially if they were to start giving more and more quantities of their product to these bigger distributors that might be able to offer them more competitive prices, I wonder if moving forward, you know, the comic book retailer might be able to sell these books for a little bit cheaper and maintain the same profit, because I imagine distribution might become a little bit cheaper.
Well, that's quite frankly, that not only is the hope, but I think that will be the reality, to be honest with you. I think there's going to be an adjustment period, but I know again from my retailer, and I would encourage, I mean, not that everybody does this. Most people probably don't go into their comic shop like I do, and I BS with my comic. You know, he's a friend of mine. We talk all the time, and he's very straight up with me. There's most of what he ships, like he gets very frustrated. People forget that when Marvel Comics wants to sell free comics, it's not free to the retailer, and it costs them more for shipping. So when Marvel Comics wants to give away free comic books and they give an extra 300 copies of another first issue free to retailers, they got to pay the shipping on that. And if nobody's buying that the retailer covers that. Marvel, those types of things, because of the way Diamond distribution works, it doesn't do the retailer any favors often. Sometimes it does, but most of the time it does not. And another example is the Previews magazine. There are many times I know my retailer, he'll look through Previews magazine, and there are some product that he will always look to others to ship before Diamond. And often he has other distributors ship it because it's still cheaper to pay a little bit more to others up front in order to establish a relationship with the new distributor, because it's cheaper in the long run than staying with Diamond. And he does that routinely for toys, for action figures, for T-shirts. He doesn't have Diamond distribute that stuff. He can go through a third party, and that's what they've been doing it already. A lot of retailers have been doing this already for years, and they're only stuck with Diamond because they don't have a choice with respect to comic books. A little bit of competition goes a very, very long way.
Yeah, I think especially in a world where Diamond has been the undisputed distributor of pretty much every large comic book publisher out there, because I think that they are so used to a cushy environment where they have no competition. So I think that introducing a legitimate threat to them may cause them to initiate some sorts of plans to become a little bit more of a competitive, option, whether it be various policies that they're going to have from returns to, those free comics that the bigger publishers want to distribute, so on and so forth. So I think that there could be some really interesting options in terms of where we move from here regarding distribution. But one of the big questions, I think, and this is namely for the big two publishers, is what is going to happen continuity wise, because they're obviously planning these events way in advance. And I know that the big two publishers are still trying to keep their writers and their artists working in perpetuity. So, not knowing what the market is going to receive well, because obviously they're going to be getting further and further and further ahead of the curve if, they end up having to completely halt distribution digitally, physically, however. I wonder if that's going to affect the trajectory of continuity moving forward, because obviously DC is in a very volatile state with, AT&T and T and the firing of Dan DiDio, and it was already kind of showing symptoms of that way before the coronavirus, because I don't think it's going to be an insane thing to say that I don't think DC 5G, whatever it is not the same thing that they were going to do 6 months ago.
I think you're exactly right. And it was a Dark Knight. It was a perfect storm. It was a perfect storm for DC. If if we were writing an Armageddon story for the death of comic books or for a huge epic crisis for DC Comics, we couldn't have written a better one than this. Editorial struggles, comic book struggles, Bendis coming and failing utterly, continuity, a mess, Dan DiDio being fired, and then throw in a pandemic, the likes of which this entire planet has not seen yet, an economic shutdown, the likes of which the world has never seen. This is really the perfect storm for all of comicdom, and in particular DC Comics. But look, at the end of the day here, what this is going to do is, and you and I have talked about this a lot, and that is, and you in particular have emphasized that, what happened to the good stories? The best stories. You tell a good story, people are going to come back. This to me is going to cull the herd, not just in the viral sense, in terms of probably building some degree of herd immunity regarding the pandemic, but really cull the herd, because only the best stories are going to survive, and maybe only the best writers are going to be the ones that the big two and all the publishing companies will focus on, because there's a lot of really bad, poor storytelling narratives out there. And we talked about this, and it's very frustrating. And I think that with DC moving forward, if they're already they were already cutting their publications, prioritizing young adult fiction, comic book graphic novels. And now with comic books, I think that hopefully whatever they do with 5G, they're going to be focused on more of the quality storytelling. And I predict going back, they're going to stick to the classics. I still say, I just don't believe they're going to go with Luke Fox for Batman. I don't believe they're going to, I really do think they have to scrap their plans for 5G for the fifth generation. If they don't, they're insane. They have to stick with their classic, with their safety net, what they know works, and just focus on good storytelling. And I believe that's what they will do, or we're going to see more people getting fired.
Yeah, no, I certainly hope that's the case. I tend to be very, very skeptical when it comes to things along these lines. Sorry, we're getting like some of that static that we had from like a couple episodes back, and it keeps taking me off my train of thought.
Sorry, I shut my other computer off here, so I got.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's like a speaker thing. It might be a connection thing, because I'm sure that everybody is online all the time right now. Which it was something I was actually kind of afraid about. I was like, oh man, I really hope that everybody being online taking up bandwidth isn't going to mess up the stream. But I can't help but be skeptical, because I think even now people still buy books for spectacle. You know, like the books that sell aren't always the books that are the best written. And I think that a lot of the stories that have shown to be these big artistic masterpieces in comics generally take a couple years for the rest of the herd to finally understand how good they are, and they'll see more sales on the back end, but front end not so much. And so it makes me a little bit scared just because of my inherent skeptical nature. I mean, regardless of the quality, Death Metal 2 is going to be one of the highest selling comic books of this year. There's no way around it, just as its predecessor was. So it's a little bit scary. I mean, even Bendis, Bendis isn't doing good numbers for DC, and he's not doing anywhere near what Bendis numbers should have been doing. But I mean, his Action Comics and his Superman are still somehow selling somewhere between 30 and 40,000 copies, which nowadays is decent numbers. And for whatever's going on, they haven't taken Bendis off the books. So
Yeah.
I don't know. It's definitely a little bit scary because I'd like to be positive. I'd like to hope that, natural selection will take its course in comic books, but I'm also not entirely confident drawing that conclusion because the industry at all times has fueled speculation and has fueled, all of that. It's hard to say, all of the fluff. People will gravitate towards something just because it looks cool and not because it's necessarily going to be a great story.
It's going to be interesting to see on Monday, this Monday, March 30th. Well, tomorrow. Good Lord, the days keep blurring into each other. Marvel is supposed to give their formal official response to where they stand on distribution and on the digital platform moving forward in the absence of being able to provide physical copies to collect to us comic fans. So it's going to be interesting to see what Marvel's formal position is going to be moving forward, at least at this time. At the end of the day, in terms of stories, all we can do is, hope for the best. I mean, quite frankly, I've had issues with the quality of DC stories lately going into 5G, and that's it. That was before the pandemic. This pandemic is, I think, quite frankly, hopefully the stories can only get better because, most of the writers are self-isolating themselves anyway because that's the nature of their job, isn't it? They hide themselves in a room and they write. And so I don't necessarily think that the direction of the storylines are going to go any differently unless editorial steps up and says, hey, this is what we need to do. One of the comments I made, I was on another live stream last night. One of the comments I had made there was, what the comic book industry is missing right now, Dark Knight, is a spokesperson. We don't have a Kevin Feige for the comic book industry. Stan Lee died, and who speaks for the comic book industry? Where's the ones? We don't have a hero that we can point to. Who's the hero standing up and defending the comic book industry and getting people excited? DC, it's pathetic. DC and Marvel are what I find shameful about their approach to this is that there isn't one person or a figurehead that they point to that is their spokesperson, that brags and talks about comic books. They rely upon us. They rely upon us YouTubers to do it for them. And I got no problem doing it. But, I'm just Joe Schmo with my 900 subs, whoop-de-doo, and yourself. I mean, we love comics. We're knowledgeable. But, let's face it. There's no celebrity person and I think that's what the industry needs. That's part of marketing. That's part of marketing. Look at Kevin Feige for the Marvel movie. Now, during these pandemic times, I think we need that more than ever. It's pathetic. I remember watching Marvel comics at I think it was the San Diego Comic-Con. They have their live coverage and they get complete nobodies hosting their lives, their live streams and everything else. I mean, I'm sorry, get a celebrity. There's lots of celebrities that claim that they read comic books, like I'm told Samuel Jackson does. I'm I'm told some of the members of some movie stars who've been in the Marvel movie, get them to speak about comic books. Pay them to do it. You know, to me, it's just, if you love this industry and you want it to survive, you know, you'll get back what you give. Put something into it advertising wise, but you know, Marvel and DC simply don't do that. They're very spoiled. They are very spoiled. They rely on guys like you and me to sell the comic books for them. And you know, look, let's, you know, we're not, there's only so much that we can do. And besides, I haven't been doing a lot of good advertising for DC lately because most of the time I've just been bitching.
Yeah, no, I mean it is a really rough scenario, and I think you're right. And it's interesting because for better or for worse, DC fired the only person that was attempting to do that for them. You know,
That's right.
say what you want about Dan DiDio and what he was doing behind the scenes. The one thing I definitely give him credit for was the amount of energy that he brought to these panels and such when he made these public appearances talking about DC Comics or whatever the new initiative was. I mean, I remember when him and Jim Lee got up on stage, kind of starting to create that swarm of excitement for DC Rebirth at, I think it was WonderCon a couple years ago. And that was electric. I remember watching that live stream on YouTube and just being more excited than ever to be a comic book fan. And I think that's something that we need. And, you know, I think that says something, especially because I am the skeptical type. I tend to lean skeptical. And if you have somebody like that who can make a skeptic more excited than ever, I think it definitely says something. I mean, when we went to New York Comic Con, I mean, they didn't even have Jonathan Hickman at the big Marvel X-Men panel, which I think was a huge mistake. They had some random video, pre-recorded video of Hickman for like 2 minutes, and the rest of the talk was by, you know, all of the people writing the B-list X-Men books for the most part. And I'll admit, I mean, the panel was still great. I still remember walking out of that being excited for the X-Men. But you know what would have made me like a chipper 7-year-old? If Jonathan Hickman walked out on that stage and talked to me a little bit about what his grand scheme was for X-Men, and by extension, a very large portion of the Marvel universe. So I think that definitely says something, is that they're not on top of the pulse in terms of putting the people out there publicly who are going to affect the minds and the hearts of the masses who want to read these books. You know, and that is a huge, huge, huge thing. I remember years past. I remember, I think it was my first New York Comic Con before Doomsday Clock came out, and it was when that was the panel when they revealed Rorschach was going to be in Doomsday Clock, and it was before we had the identity of Rorschach. But I remember when they gave us those black and white ash cans, and the last page was Rorschach in the prison cell, and everybody freaked the hell out. And like, you know, having somebody like Jeff Johns sit there and preach like his gospel of his comics, that was huge. That was absolutely massive. So I totally agree with you. I think DC, Marvel, I think they need a face. They need an individual face or a mouthpiece for their books, for their worlds, for, you know, their corner of the industry, because it gets people excited, whether or not the initiative is going to be good or not. I mean, I can imagine that when the New 52 first happened, that whatever publicity they were putting out there probably got a number of people excited. Now, there are a large number of people that were highly disappointed in the New 52, but whatever marketing and publicity they did worked, because the New 52 was one of the most financially successful, at least the launch was one of the most financially successful eras of DC Comics ever.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And you know, there's an old expression, you know, what you focus on grows. What you nurture grows. What you put care into grows. And it's very obvious that DC in particular, well, and I suppose arguably the entire industry, that, you know, they're not particularly focused. And there isn't. And the other thing about the industry as a whole is that it doesn't work together very well. They don't seem to coordinate very well beyond Free Comic Book Day. And even that, they don't actually coordinate particularly well either, if one's to be quite blunt about it. And, you know, again, it's one of those things, and you know, it's been said that this pandemic is affecting the movie industry as well.
Big time.
And the fear here is that, with AT&T focusing on Warner Brothers and the integrity of the movie making industry from their perspective, Disney is going to be focused on the integrity of their movies. Uh, I don't see comic books in the pandemic or post-pandemic times. I don't see the focus of AT&T and Disney being necessarily ensuring that the print division survives more so than anything else. I think it's going to be probably one of their least priorities. And I definitely see Marvel scaling back all of their publications where, say goodbye to Mary Jane issue 1, volume 7, whatever it's on now, and all these other obscure little characters that are getting their own titles, and all these diverse, no more safe spots and snowflakes, snowflake characters and new warriors nonsense, that's going to be creating negative publicity. There's going to be a focus on what sells. And I think it's going to be a real eye-opening experience. And you're going to see more of a focus again on what sells. And that's the classic characters. And that's just, and again, that's, hopefully it'll breed better storytelling. And,
Hopefully.
we'll have that to fall back on.
Yeah, on that, I can't help but think that Marvel has a much better infrastructure than DC right now, because I think Disney, to some degrees, has already invested some time and some money into developing a structure. It seems like, at least you get the feeling that CB Cebulski functions very independently, and is able to move Marvel. And I think that having that firm editorial and executive um, kind of guidance to look up to is what might save Marvel, whereas DC doesn't have that right now. Not to mention, at least Disney has always been an entertainment company. AT&T is a fucking cell phone provider. Like that was like their big start. Cell phone, cable, those types of services. They're not an independent. They're not not an independent. They're not an entertainment company. And that's huge. And it shows they don't know how to run anything to this degree. I mean, what was it when Diane Nelson became head of DC Comics? She was some sort of executive dealing in some other bullshit that I don't care about. And that's why when she was president of DC Comics, their trajectory was going towards DCU, which was undoubtedly one of the most mediocre periods in DC's collected mainline. Like,
Yeah.
that is a huge thing. So I'm a little bit more worried for DC Comics under AT&T for the reasons that you kind of pointed out there. And I really do hope that this is, a survival of the fittest, only the good stories will last scenario, because I actually, just giving Joe a shout out who joined us in the chat. I was having a conversation with him earlier today about how it's really frustrating that it seems like, or not even that it seems like, that a lot of times, like, there are a lot of good stories that get and that don't sell. And it's definitely a disappointing thing that quality doesn't drive the market, because I feel like in most industries it does. There are obviously a couple instances where good stuff will slip through the cracks. But man, is it really frustrating that Black Cat #1 sold 250,000 copies for mediocre story, and you have books like Robert Venditti's Freedom Fighter just bottom feeding for numbers when it's an incredible story with incredible art. So, do with that information what you will, but it's certainly frustrating. And I really hope that, the the mm, the aggressive change and the requirement for the industry to adapt moving forward will be something that breaks that trend. I really hope that's the case.
And to be even more optimistic, having comic books sold at the bookstores instead of comic book shops would very well give it possibly more exposure to a different market, and it might actually lead to greater sales, than for a lot of those comic books that are good and probably deserve more attention than they've been getting. And again, I don't see this being. I see change right now as being a good thing. This needs to be done whether we were in a pandemic or not. And I think the positive thing is sometimes it's sort of like being in a bad relationship. If you're in a bad relationship but you don't have the courage to end it, and then suddenly the person you're in a relationship with ends the relationship for you and breaks up with you, and you've got this sense of relief, that's I think that's what's happened here. I think that was what the pandemic did. I think Marvel and DC, particularly DC, I don't think any comic book publishing company really is happy with Diamond. Nobody likes Diamond distribution. Nobody likes the current system. Everybody complains about it. And finally, I think this is the crisis that needed to happen, that everybody wanted to happen, but yet everybody was too afraid to admit it. Now, of course, it's unfortunate that it was in the form of a pandemic. Obviously, we want everybody to stay safe and, be healthy and be alive in a few months to read more comic books. But, this is one of those things where sometimes change, whatever the reason for the change, whatever the motivation is, I think we have to look at the positive side, and it's always going to create some discomfort. And if that means I've got to go 2 or 3 months without a physical copy of my comics or even some digital copies, I got no problem with that, because I want this industry to thrive and survive. And I don't think it can do that long term under the existing model.
I think you make a good point, man. I respect your martyrdom over there in your neck. Yeah, no. So I think, moving forward for the conversation, one of the big questions to ask are, how do you think, and I think you've said it in pieces throughout this conversation, but I'd like to get your kind of full, concise idea as to how you think the comic book industry is going to recover and move forward from this pandemic. What positive things do you see coming out of it, and how do you think the status quo is going to be changed?
Well, I think that all companies, this is what they should do if they're smart. Go full digital and don't apologize for it. I straight up mean that. Go full digital, don't apologize for it. Go ahead, give lip service to retailers, comic book retailers, but we're talking about the survival of the comic book industry. That has to be the priority. It has to be, not the survival of comic book retailers. If 3 or 4 months of not having physical copies shuts you down as a business, you shouldn't have been in the business. Of course, that's harsh, and I don't wish that on anybody, but it's the reality. And in the general scheme of things, that's just the way it's got to be. And that's straight up. That's just the harsh truth. Because in the future, I want comic books to exist. They're going to exist digitally. I think it's ridiculous, and it would be absurd to not put out comic books digitally because you're worried about 20% of the comic book shops, which represents approximately 350 to 360 comic book shops in North America. Yes, that's all catered to the 360 comic book retailers out there, and not put out the digital materials. Bear in mind what that will do. If you don't put out the stuff digitally, they've already planned for the trades. So they've got these other contracts that DC already has with Random House, with other they're setting up a new printer. They're going to have a new distribution network for all these trades. They got to put out the floppies first, even on digital, in order to get to the point where they can print the trades in 5 or 6 months' time to sell to various bookstores, which would include comic book retailers anyway. So if we end up going back to our comic book retailer, instead of buying the physical floppy, we might end up buying the actual trade instead, which contains all 6 of the floppies at a cheaper price overall than if we would have bought the floppies individually. So it just makes sense. So again, all this talk about feeling sorry for retailers, I get it, I do. But at the same time, I think that misses the boat a little bit here. Let's not try. To me, that's like, don't try to. It's like trying to save. It's like focusing on the tree instead of the forest when the forest is on fire. I mean, you got to save the integrity of the forest. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You got to put the fire out, and that might mean letting some of the individual trees burn. That's just going to happen. and you can't save everybody. And so that's, um, if the market is there, it's there. And focusing on the digital right now, I think is important, because the physical copies, they will follow. But for now, you don't want to lose the market. You got to put out new material. I don't want people to stop thinking that there's new comic book material not being out there. And is it really a bad thing of people from physical media move more to digital anyway? Really? And besides which, are you really going to lose them? I don't know about you, but I got a problem. I got an addiction to comic books. I need the physical copy. And so if I end up buying digital, the stories that are the best, I'm going to buy physical anyway, and I'm going to go to my comic book retailer and try to get it through him. And if I can't, I'll go to comic book shops. But I don't want this entire controversy to just be resolved by putting comic book retailers first. It hasn't worked for 25 to 30 years, so maybe it's time to put that model aside and focus on what's best for the industry, not individual retailers, because the two are not necessarily synonymous. And maybe we have to stop kidding ourselves that they are.
Yeah, you make a very good point. The primary concern is making sure that the industry walks out of this pandemic, because most entertainment industries right now are being shaked, rattled, and rolled all over the freaking place. And it is an unfortunate thing. Like you take a very practical approach there with what you're saying, and I got to admit, I think that you're right. I don't think that it's smart for any publisher to take any sort of hiatus because of local comic book stores. They have to distribute their product. They have to get it out there. And on top of that, I think even before making sure that these local comic book stores make money, and I am a huge proponent of local comic book stores. I'm sponsored by one. I spend more money at my LCS than I do on any of my other bills. So this is nothing against local comic book stores, but those publishers have to pay their employees too. They need to keep them above the sea level there, and up and afloat, before they keep these comic book stores afloat. So there is a chain of priorities, and unfortunately, comic book stores aren't necessarily near the top there. I think the decision that it was Boom, I think in particular, that made, in terms of not distributing physical, or not distributing their books through digital if they're not coming out with physical. I think it's a valiant decision to make, but I don't necessarily feel that it's the right one.
Yeah. No, it's like I say, tough decisions have to be made. But at the end of the day, it's about getting your product to market. And the other thing is, let's let's just be extremely brutally honest here. What better time to increase your digital market than during a pandemic?
Mm.
Why on earth would you not want to put out new comic book digital stories during a pandemic when people are isolated at home and the only thing they got to entertain themselves is the internet? Why would you be stupid enough not to put your comic books online digitally? It's absolutely asinine not to do it.
To that regard too, their profit margin is much larger, because not only are they not paying for shipping and as much of the distribution, they're also not paying to print the book. And physically printing the book is one of the biggest costs of production. So
of course,
it's unfortunate for me to say, because I, like I like to support my local store. I am addicted to having a physical copy, but not everybody is like us, and unfortunately, there still needs to be modes of transmission for these stories and for those products. It's scary, the part of me that is in love with the culture of having a comic book store and being able to interact and talk, face to face with people who are like me that love that material is really, really important to me. But no, I can't deny that you make great points here, in that
yeah. And
we need to be pragmatic.
yeah, and I just want to. I think it's worth noting, and that one of the things that I like about watching your reviews is that you're very good at breaking down a scene and describing what works and what doesn't in a story. I think it's worth noting, and this is one thing that we haven't done before, and I think at some point, maybe if we could set it up, we should do it. For those people out there who have never read a comic book digitally, and probably most people who might end up watching this have, but it's a potentially very different reading experience when you read a comic book on
Yeah.
comicsology. It's very, very interesting because it can actually, because you can use the transition mode, or
The guided
I
view.
forget what they call it, the guided view. And the guided view option is extremely interesting because the guided view controls what images you see, as opposed to when you read a comic physically, you can sometimes cheat or you end up seeing the next scene accidentally. You don't get that option when you watch it digitally, and it's almost more of a quasi movie experience when you read a comic book digitally on guided view, and it's really, really good. And sometimes it's more entertaining because you get more suspense, you get more buildup of fear, you get more anticipation, and it's something that I would encourage people to do anyway. And again, I'm not talking people out of physical media. I'm just saying that, you know, uh, I'm self-aware enough to realize that digital media does have something that contribute to the comic book industry and has, and there's a reason why a lot of people really do it. I gotta, most of us have big screen TVs. Watch a comic book on guided view on your big screen TV. You're gonna be entertained if you like comic books. You're
Yeah,
gonna enjoy putting it on your big screen. I
but
mean, it's really
I'll forward
good.
you this though, and this is one of the reasons why I think guided view is a double-edged sword because it's good for all of the reasons that you stated. But to the same degree, it takes away from experiencing panel layout, which is huge. And the way that these artists are taking the time to design a page and the way they're orienting them, that's one of the things that I talk about a lot when I break down books. And it's an important aspect that is so inherently comic book. And I talk about, how having those panel layouts moving forward is a big contributor to something feeling cinematic. But I like to be able to experience those page designs, to follow it, because there is something artistic in that design element in and of itself that makes comics unique. And I think by strictly reading guided view, you take away something that is so centrally comics. I think,
Well,
I don't mind reading old school comics before page layouts became such an important quality of the storytelling with the guided view. But nowadays, whenever I do read modern books on comicsology, I read the full page by full page, or I'll even just zoom in and scroll down the page because I want to experience that full layout. Now, I'll say that I think the nice thing is you can go individual page by page rather than
sure.
accidentally being spoiled by the following page if the creative team isn't being good about being deliberate in where they're putting specific things via page turn. But guided view is, like I said, it's a double-edged sword because I think it takes away some very, very important aspects of reading a comic, and it takes away from the experience that makes comics special,
Well,
because
I would.
and those page layouts are a very important part about setting scenes, establishing tone, developing pace for comics. And I think you lose that when you're reading guided view.
Well, I would. I would. Uh, you're right. You're right. Actually, I'm gonna disagree in one respect. I think the choice of saying you lose it, you don't actually lose it. You experience it differently. So I will agree with you that you can experience something in a more. Sometimes you can have a better experience reading it with the full page. Sometimes, though, you can experience it differently and better with the guided view, or vice versa. I will add that when you watch things digitally, you have the choice, as you said, you have the choice to use guided view. You can still digitally read a comic book as you normally would, just have page by page. But it's also the case that uh, writers will write a comic book differently, and they will make different choices on layout and design, and artists can, if they know it's only going to be on a digital platform.
But
And
layout
that's
in terms of guided view, layout becomes completely obsolete because all you have to do is put the panels in a particular sequence, and the screen will, go straight to the panel. You don't even see the panel borders, which
well,
becomes an important
that's
part.
again, I'm not sure how you use guided view, but you can use guided view that when it gets to the end of the page, it will show you the entire page and then go to the next one. Use guided view, gets to the end of the page, and then it shows you the full page. So, I mean, it depends on what your settings are when you're watching it. So, and again, I think, you know, I often, when I use guided view, sometimes it frustrates me, I admit, because I'm so used to seeing the full page. I get, it's almost like it triggers me a little bit sometimes because I don't know what page I'm on in the comic book. If I'm on guided view, I don't know if I'm on page 10 or 11 or 12, if I'm not paying attention. And sometimes it frustrates me because I'm so old school. But no, I hear what you're saying. I think that I think a lot of people, for example, like digital comics are what my wife, she insists that she doesn't know how to read a comic book. She doesn't know how to read, and I know I laugh at her when she says that. I go, well, how do you not know that? You look from left to right, and you go down the page. I mean, how can you not know how to read a comic? She just doesn't enjoy the experience of reading a comic book. She finds it's frustrating.
Mm.
She would benefit from a guided view. She sort of likes to be sort of, really spoon fed and sit back, and she's more of a, that's just her sort of thing.
Mm.
And even during these pandemic times, I can't get her to read a comic book. I don't know what's going on. But in any event, I tried.
Yeah, the thing is too with guided view, I've only had it zoom out to the entire page if I do it manually or if it's a big splash page. That's the only time that I've ever seen it do it automatically, at least. Yeah, I mean, I think like guided view is cool in some regards, but I think it really takes away from the experience of experiencing the layouts because some of these layouts are a huge part of the way that you're interpreting, the narrative in and of itself. Not to mention, obviously, the craftsmanship that goes into it. And I think that it's super important. Like I said, when I read digitally, I don't really use guided view. I'll do single page at a time so that I can just experience the way that the artist wants you, who is the director, who is the cinematographer, how they want you to experience the book. And I think that's very, very important, especially with comics, because it is very different from film. There's a reason that comics aren't film, where there are some qualities you want it to pull from cinema, but in other ways, you don't want it to lose what inherently makes it special. You know, I think that is a huge quality, and the more that I review comics and the more I get into kind of thinking from the perspective of the editor, uh, the more I enjoy experiencing panel layout and page design and how they're setting those things up and how that contributes to the story overall. Because I think it is one of those things that not a lot of comic book fans are able to articulate. But I think deep down, those layouts and page design and the way they're sequencing things and shaping the panels and orienting them, I think it does affect their experience, whether or not they can articulate it and whether or not they realize it, because it is one of those kind of silent contributors to the narrative. But I think it is a huge, huge part of experiencing comics that I don't want to take away. And if people love guided view, they love guided view. And I think that, like you said, there are some definite benefits. But I think when you're reading books that have artists that take very particular directions in their page layouts, I think it does their work a disservice. For example, I would never read Grant Morrison and Liam Sharp's Green Lantern #1 in guided view because Liam Sharp takes a lot of really, really great cues, to create these very geometric page layouts. And the way he's orienting them really adds to the science fiction space odyssey style tone. Um, and I don't think I could get that from guided view.
Yeah. No, like I said, it's all the more reason why it is a different medium in and of itself than the physical copy. And that really is the point to emphasize, is that it can be a different reading experience, digital versus physical. And it will be interesting to see, as more of us who are accustomed to physical, I think we're naturally going to make the transition to at least try more digital in the months to follow. It's going to be interesting to see the effect that has. I predict that it's going to be a natural little bump in digital sales, but I think that we're going to return to print media, and it might be with fewer comic book shops, but we're going to more than make up for it with the bookstores. And it might be a little bit of a bumpy ride, but you know what? Welcome to that's going to be true of everyone. Welcome to the post-pandemic times when it arrives, because there's going to be an adjustment for all businesses, and I don't think the bookstore market is any different. It's going to be interesting to see what the book scan market shows in terms of sales for 2020 in the midst of all this, because I'm sure it's not just comic book publishing. It's all book publishing is struggling with this, and I would be curious to know if there's going to be an increase in digital sales across the board for just ordinary books, in Cole's bookstore and Chapters and Barnes and Noble. It's going to be interesting. All these, we live in interesting times. It's going to be interesting to see, but there's going to be definitely, I think, a rather curious, interesting effect on all sales.
Yeah, no, you make a very good point, and I think the big takeaway from this is that there are a lot of questions moving forward about the future and how things are going to transgress. I don't think either one of us are making these statements, kind of making these large assumptions that they're definitely going to happen because this pandemic has really shaken up the world, let alone the comic book industry. So I think that seeing what's going to happen moving forward is going to be a very interesting and bumpy ride, as you said. And I hope that the bumpy ride does lead to a little bit more of a strong grounded position for the industry and for these publishers individually. So it's going to be really interesting. And as we're closing out this conversation, Boom, is there anything else that you wanted to make note of about the current situation of the comic book industry and COVID-19?
Well, first, I would just remind people to keep an eye on maybe Bleeding Cool News or the Marvel websites. Marvel Comics is going to be giving an official statement apparently tomorrow sometime, usually probably around between 10 and noon Eastern Standard Time, I would imagine. Chances are I would expect Marvel. Well, I'm not sure what to expect from Marvel, to be honest. I suspect that they're absolutely going to be proceed to. They've got too many comic books in the pike. They're going to be selling digitally across the board. That's my prediction. Again, I don't know how they could possibly avoid not doing so. And um, you know, at the end of the day, this is about the saving the comic book industry, and that I would emphasize that. And as much as I love my retailer, I'm still going to enjoy comic books, whether it's digital or otherwise. And I still think print media isn't dead. It just means that worst case scenario, we're just going to be buying it from a different source if our local comic shop happens to fold.
Mm. Yeah, it's really interesting times, and I think that the one big takeaway that we can definitely say is the dismantling of Diamond Distribution's monopoly over the industry, and I think that's something where we could, I think, pretty universally and come together and say that that is going to be the most positive thing, or at least the most definite positive thing that we're going to be getting out of this whole pandemic in regards to the comic book industry, and hopefully we see more. But you know, I'm uh I'm I'm wondering, Boom, what you got coming up this week with all of the crazy quarantining? What videos can people look forward to be entertained by?
Well, for me, I'm gonna probably do a Wonder Woman review of issue 752. I'll be reviewing Suicide Squad #4. I just did a review of Artemis and the Assassin, which I love. It deals with it's based on it's a time travel tale, which sort of builds on the heroism of our real world's hero, Virginia Hall, who was the one of the greatest spies of World War II, and also happens to be a woman, and she had a wooden leg that she called Cuthbert. All a true story. The time travel's not true, obviously, but it's a lot of fun. Deals with the assassin, comes back in time, kills Rasputin, and then has to kill her as well. In World War II, she was essential in disrupting German troop movements, leading to the D-Day invasion in France in 1944. So taking her out would no doubt affect history. And it's well written. Stephanie Phillips writes it. It's written by I think it's Aftershock. It's a really great comic book, and I reviewed that. I'd encourage people to read that and look at Wikipedia for Virginia Hall. And I'm sure I got some ideas for live streams I want to do with you as well, Dark Knight. And I want to propose one to Joe Geek Show. Maybe all three of us will do it. And yeah, so I'm having a lot of fun. I'm making the most out of the pandemic. And one of the things I enjoy is the fact I am enjoying the fact that I get to read more comic books. I'm catching up on more comic books. And I also want to put out a review of God Country. I've got thumbnails done for a long time for it, but I've never had the time to do it. But I'm hoping to do that. So
Well,
what about yourself?
well, I've been procrastinating reviewing this guy on the channel for forever because I just haven't been feeling like filming lately for some reason. But I'm hoping that I will have some lunch or dinner because it's 4:30 over here, and have the energy to record and put that baby out. Otherwise, I think that just seeing, I'm going to take another look at what's coming out this week, but it doesn't seem like anything major. And in that regard, I may finally do my review of Donny Cates Thor issue 1 through 4. I've been procrastinating it because I get I get really anxious about trying to squeeze 4 issues worth of review into one video without taking forever and a half because I'm long-winded as hell. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, those are kind of the directions. And obviously, every week you and I sit down to do an episode of Let's Talk Comics. So I'm sure you and I will brainstorm what the next big topic is going to be. But yeah, I definitely want to make sure everybody who's watching this live now and anybody who's watching this on demand, go check out Comic Boom's channel. He's on the road to 1,000 very deserved subscribers. You can find the link to his channel in the description below. One of the best damn comic book reviewers on the internet right now. Mark my words. So yeah, I want to make sure you guys go check that out. And if you guys are looking for some really cool reading material and a great conversation, Comic Boom and I actually did a really, really great stream, if I may say so myself, talking about comics and quarantine recommendations that you can find via my channel link in the description below. So if you're not already, make sure you've liked this video and make sure you go check out the link in the description to go to Comic Boom's channel, subscribe to his channel, subscribe to my channel as well. And I want to thank everybody for joining us during these crazy times. And I hope that we were able to provide some level of entertainment or maybe a little bit of information and hopefully clarity on what's coming with the comic book industry. So thank you everybody for watching. Thank you, Comic Boom, for joining me. And
Thank you, Dark Knight.
Absolutely, man. Anytime. This is going to be Dark Knight Nation and Comic Boom signing out for the night.